Okay, I'm here with Kathy Minardi, and my name is Joseph Wood. I'm the head of school at Montessori Radmore in Michigan, and Kathy is a longtime head of school at Aiden Montessori in Washington, D.C., and since then she has kind of evolved what she's doing with Montessori to reach a very, very broad group of Montessorians. And the reason that I'm interviewing Kathy is because I was coaching high school football and teaching physical education. And Kathy recruited me into the Montessori world where the clay was knocked off of my eyes. And as Kathy says, once you see Montessori, you can't unsee it. So she was kind of my gateway into Montessori, and I'm privileged to have the honor of interviewing Kathy. So hi, Kathy, how are you?
Hi, Joe. It's so good to see you and reconnect. And I'm so thrilled with the work that you've been doing in Michigan. It's just astounding how you have moved into this wonderful field of Montessori leadership. Really proud to know you.
So you got me into Montessori. I have to ask, how did you get into Montessori?
Okay. Well, a very long time ago, in college, I was an education major. I grew up in Minnesota and I went to St. Olaf College, which was a Scandinavian-based private college in Minnesota. And my one of my education professors was getting his PhD. He hadn't obtained it yet. He was working on his dissertation, and he was very interested in alternative, as he put it, forms of education. And we happened at that college to have this wonderful program, which was an independent study program where you could go abroad and you could look at, doing real research. So, for the first time in my life, together we designed a research project, and I headed to London. And I wanted to go to London because when I was a child, my pen pal was a young girl my age who had lived through World War II. And my neighbor had been in the service in England and had lived with this family. So she knew the little girl. And so we kind of grew up writing to each other. And I wanted to go there because she was a teacher, her parents were teachers, and I could stay there while I did my research. So I went off to London with this whole design of looking at various forms of education that were not the typical pattern in England, which was very set on social class. And there was this effort to move away from that and to bring equity into education. So, among the schools that I looked at, I went to the Maria Montessori Institute, which was one of the, first training centers and schools in the heart of London. Some very famous Montessori people trained and taught there, and the clay fell off of my eyes. And I was able to report on my research, what I experienced, and my education professor was able to put it into his dissertation. So I was actually quoted in that dissertation. So that whole process just was incredible opportunity for me, but it also opened my eyes to really what my heart was seeking. And I was so happy to have found Montessori at that time in my life. I was a junior in college. And so then when I graduated, I went off to training and begun my career.
I had never heard that story. That's amazing.
No
Thank you
one's
for
ever
telling me.
asked before.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you. Okay, so my next question is: you spent the better part of 2 decades at Aiden Montessori in Washington, D.C. Tell me about one of the many early challenges that you faced there.
Sure. Well, coming to Aden, first of all, I should say that it was um, it was at a very important time for the school. It's one of the oldest Montessori schools in America. It was formed in 1961 by a group of parents who were studying education and fell in love with Montessori's work and decided to open the school. Um, and it had opened on the campus of a Catholic women's college that folded 2 years later, and the school needed a place to be, and so it moved to Military Road, which is the cross between 16th Street and Connecticut Avenue, the major corridors of Washington, D.C., which you know. And it leased the educational wing of Temple Sinai for 35 years. And so after 35 years, the temple wanted to use its own facilities and said, you need to find a new place. And so it, through great expense and loss and difficulty and struggle, it ended up purchasing from the Catholic Archdiocese a beautiful school in the heart of Woodley Park, across from the Marriott Conference Center, and 2 blocks from the National Zoo. So that move was huge. And right after the move and the relocation, the head of school passed away. She died of a brain aneurysm. Her name was Marcia Donnelly. And Marcia had led that school so beautifully. It was so beloved. And she died after she returned home from back to school night. And so that the board had a national search, and I was hired to be the next head of school. So I came into the school at a time where there was enormous grief and loss, and a whole year of waiting for a new leader, and the fact that they had just barely gotten into the building. So some of the challenges were building oriented, no air conditioning yet. The zoning hadn't been finished. There were a lot of those challenges, but the biggest challenge was the fact that the school had lost a majority of students. It was down to 80 children from close to 200. And so that financial loss meant that there wasn't enough money to pay all the Montessori guides. And at that time in history, which was in the 90s, late 90s, many women still lived with their husband earning the major living. And that was the case with our Montessori guides. They were married, they could get along without a salary because their husband was earning a living. And each and every one of them forgave their salary during this time, during this move. And so we had to figure out as a community how to get beyond that, how to repay the teachers for the salary lost, and how to regain our vibrant Montessori child community. And so there were a lot of steps taken. One was the promise that we would do this, to reassure our teachers that we would take care of them. Next step was bringing in a compensation expert who studied carefully, without infringing on any laws, a confidential source of what other teachers were making in our area, in the private sector, and then are determining what we could start to plan for in a year. So planning in a year, we had to raise tuition. We had to start fundraising. And we had to start finding out where the children were in our neighborhood. And as it turned out, that particular Woodley Park neighborhood was turning over. People were retiring and moving away, and pretty soon there were strollers going up and down the street. So we were lucky enough to start gathering children from that whole Woodley Park neighborhood. And then people started tuning into, oh, well, I hear that's a wonderful school. We made friends with the independent schools in our area. And they began also sharing that we were there, that we had moved there. And we made friends with them so that they would refer families to us as well. So that whole complex of those steps, within 2 years, we were able to repay our teachers and set them with a high standard of salary going forward. It's a long story, but it was lots and lots of little pieces.
Oh, no, I think the IOU story is so inspirational because, like, when you're thinking about running a school and taking care of your staff, like, that seems like it would be rock bottom, not being able to pay your teachers.
Yeah.
And my relationship with Aiden was that we were very fairly compensated, and I
Yes.
always felt valued. And it's
Yes.
so interesting that just 17 years before I got there, the school was in this position, and it slowly built up. And the location, I love taking the kids to the zoo and to
Yeah.
Tregarden Conservancy and to
Ideal.
Rock Creek Park. It's just awesome.
It was. The world was your oyster. You're just in the heart of a beautiful part of Washington, D.C. Yeah.
Yeah, that was really cool. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Next question. So, as difficult as that was, it wasn't the only challenge you faced. So my understanding is that you were on campus and in session on the morning of 9/11, 2001. Would you be willing to share about your experience and how your leadership played a key role during that time?
Yes. We are just 20 years from that occurring. This past year, 2021, is 20 years. And it seems like yesterday to me. And when I started to reflect on it this past year in September, I'm thinking that the 10-year-olds in our elementary program are now 30. That's really a wake-up call, isn't it? It's amazing. And so this story I have shared with the families and parent association over the years. Just before 9/11, which was before people had text messaging and vast emailing and all that it was still in its early technological form. Communication was more difficult. And just before 9/11, it turned out that the IMF and World Bank was going to have a conference across the street from our school at the Marriott Conference Center that particular week. And all summer long, I had struggled with that because the prior year there had been a violent situation in Seattle when they met there. And I started to have premonitions and fears that we were going to have a violent situation right in front of our school. And so I'm not saying I'm prescient, but I just had this sense. And I was worried. And I wanted to actually not hold school that week, but it was the first week after Labor Day, and you have to open. And our board said, no, we're opening. So it turns out that at the last minute, they changed their plans and they moved the whole thing downtown. So we were off the hook. But what I had done is plan a parent meeting. There were room parents in every room in the school, and the room parents were in charge of communicating with our families. So I designed a phone tree for every class. We didn't have, the technology yet, which sounds so archaic. But every room parent came that morning before the actual event occurred, and we were all in a conference room, and I passed out the phone trees. And those were a system where you call the first five people and then they call the next five people and on down the line. And so I passed these out, and we're sitting there talking about it. And suddenly, one of our parents received a call from her husband. And she answered the call on her cell phone, one of those big giant cell phones we used to carry. And he said that the towers had been hit. And we raced into the front office at Aden and looked on our black and white television, and we saw the news. And we went back to the room and we started talking about it, and we were horrified. And it wasn't very long after that that it was announced that the Pentagon had been hit. And actually, turns out later, we knew several people on that airplane who had died, who had flown out of Dulles Airport, and then it had turned around and dove into the Pentagon. And so I turned to everyone in that room, all the room parents, and said, we are going to make a plan right now. You have whatever means you have to connect with parents, your cell phones and your phone tree, and I want you to go wherever you can for a quiet place in the school and start calling. And what I want you to say to everyone is, we will be here as long as it takes for you to get to the school. We will not leave your children, but please come as soon as possible. The next thing I did was move around the school and sensitively, quietly share with each teacher what was happening. And then we set up a system in the lobby where you had to come into the school and sign your name that you were picking up your child, because we couldn't let chaos happen. I don't know how I thought of all these things in such a horrendous emergency, but we executed it. We did it. And we stayed until the last child was gone. And we got in our cars and we drove home. And after that, I think the next day, the silence of no airplanes in the air was the most stunning thing I've ever been through in my life. And just being glued to the television and not coming back to school for a good long time until we finally decided to return. My husband and I my husband's Italian, hence Minardi, and he makes these wonderful Italian foods, and we started cooking and hauling the food down to the fire station, because that's where all the people at the Pentagon were headquartered. They would come there to eat and then go back down to the Pentagon to work on the building and work on the people who had passed away. Those are my biggest memories.
Well, that's a once in a lifetime thing, and those families were really lucky to have you, and the fact that you're able to think quickly and be proactive about it. And I mean, you never know how you're gonna
I
respond
know.
in a
We were
crisis.
ready in such a strange way. And then when the children came back, we did a lot of art. We did a lot of drawing. We had opportunities for elementary children to express themselves because they knew what had happened.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you for sharing. That was a heavy topic, but I think it needs to be documented, and I think that it serves as a lesson to those of us who are in leadership now, to where if we do have a crisis, um, it's good wisdom to draw on. So thank you for sharing.
You're welcome.
Okay, moving forward on a much more positive note. So we're moving our way down towards your Aiden tenure, and
Awesome.
you worked with Yale on the ruler program, which is
Yeah.
something that we are using in our elementary.
Awesome.
Oh,
Great.
I know it's pretty cool. So can you talk a little bit about your partnership with Yale on the ruler
Yeah.
program, what it
Yeah.
is, and what the purpose
Yeah.
is?
Oh, I'm so happy to talk about it. I'm so proud of that work. Um, early, you know, in the history of this work, Howard Gardner at Harvard did the work, the research on multiple intelligences, and the one intelligence that he didn't explore in his research was emotional intelligence. And so the current president at Yale, who was a researcher at the time, Peter Salovey, did the research with a partner on emotional intelligence. And then a postdoc came to Yale to work with Peter. His name was Dr. Mark Brackett. And Mark Brackett said to Peter, well, this research is wonderful. You've identified what emotional intelligence is in every aspect, but there's no how to. And so Mark and his team designed the anchor tools so that children and adults could develop one's own emotional intelligence. And he spoke at a keynote at a Montessori conference. It was a AMI refresher. And the executive director, Virginia McHugh, brought Mark Brackett to it. A lot of people thought, well, we have grace and courtesy, so we don't really need this. But I had a sense that it was really viable and critical to start looking at it. So we brought Mark Brackett to our school. During the summer, he trained our whole staff. He trained everyone, including the janitor. We were all in, and we learned the anchor tools, and we did not bring it to the children for 2 years. For 2 years, we worked on ourselves. We worked on our own charter, which is one of the anchor tools, to be able to decide how we wanted to feel emotionally when we were at work and make agreements around that. We learned the scale of the mood meter and how to assess our own emotions. We learned the language of emotions, because most Americans don't have too many words. They have sad, glad, and mad. So we had a taxonomy of vocabulary about emotions. And as we became familiar with those anchor tools, then we started integrating them into the classroom. And our Montessori guides were so beautiful. They made mood meters out of knitting and weaving and beautiful materials. And so they could be on the shelf with the Montessori materials. And then we started integrating it into our school. So when you came as a PE teacher in those early days, children were coming back to class after recess and having a community meeting and talking about what happened and being able to use that language to assess how they felt when something happened. Yeah.
That's really great. We actually talk a lot about being aware of your feelings and not allowing it to be a codependent relationship. Like, it's not about how other people perceive me, but it's about
That's
how I
cool.
perceive myself.
Yeah.
So what a great program. And Aiden being kind of the school that was working with Yale
We
on that.
piloted it. Yeah.
Yeah,
We
I
were
think
the
it's really
first.
special.
Yeah.
That's really cool. Okay, I've got a few more questions for you. So the last thing about Aiden, AMI USA is about to, or is celebrating its 50th anniversary,
Yeah.
and Aiden
Yay.
has had a few really big ones. They had a 40th and a 50th that you were involved with. And would you be willing to talk a little bit about how Aiden celebrated their 50th and kind of how it relates to AMI USA?
Yes, yes. So actually, this coming spring is its 60th, or over the summer will be a 60th. So the 40th happened right after I got to Aden, and we learned that we were on the ceded lands of the Piscataway tribal nation, and we developed a relationship with the Piscataway tribe and chieftain, and we had a huge tribal drum made 3 feet wide, and members of the tribe came and they played for us while we celebrated that 40th. And that was just a resounding experience. I wrote the Aden song, which they still sing, and we celebrated in such an incredible way, and made friends with those whose land we were on. And then for the 50th, we started about 5 years earlier because our database, because of technology, we didn't have a technological database, and we had to build one. And it meant going into shoeboxes of lists of people. And we built the database over a couple years' time so that we could connect with people all over the country who had gone to Aden over the past 50 years. And we invited them to 2 celebrations, one in the fall, which was where they brought their whole family. People flew in from all over the country, and they brought their children, and we had a whole long day of celebration, and the children put on a play about the history of the school. We worked hard over the history of the school, doing a documentary film, interviewing families, interviewing our guides, some of whom had been there for 40 years, some of them who had come from other countries to Washington, D.C., and then got their Montessori diplomas and came to work with us. All of that we built as a document. And then Linda Tyler, who was a wonderful guide at our school, created a beautiful book. And we published the book, and that was available for everyone to celebrate as well. And then the last part of this was that we built an enormous evening in the spring to celebrate the 50th with people everywhere in the world. We invited on screen, in the hotel where we were, on screen, Lynn Lawrence, who was in Amsterdam, and others, notables who were in Europe, who came on the screen and welcomed us. The room was full of Montessori trainers and celebrants from everywhere. I remember Nora O'Donnell was a mom at that time with 3 children in our school, and she introduced David Kahn to everyone.
No
And
kidding.
he gave a speech. Yes, that was really exciting. It's fun to see her on Evening News now. And one really fabulous thing happened to us. We had lost track of who the first teacher of the school was, and we didn't know whether she was alive or not. And in the fall of that year, I was invited to a special education conference of public and private school leaders. I was the only Montessorian, and I sat next to a woman from the graduate professor of education at the graduate school at Berkeley, UC Berkeley. And we turned to introduce each other, and I told her who I was and where I worked, and she said, I know the first teacher. I worked in Washington, D.C. for years, and when she was ill and had to leave the school, I helped raise her baby. And I said, is she still alive? And she said, oh, yes, she's in her late 80s, and she lives at the Watergate.
Huh.
So we were able to find her and connect with her, and she was at our 50th celebration. And she died within a year after that, but her name was Margaret Dunn, Um, and we were able to celebrate her life and the fact that she was our first teacher. It was just a miracle that that happened.
Wow.
Yeah. And it meant so much to her,
Oh, of course. That's so cool.
isn't it? Yes. So we had, oh my gosh, we just had so many AMI trainers at, people just came to celebrate Aiden because it had also hosted the WMI, Washington Montessori Institute, at a time when it was moving. Um, the history is incredible.
Well, thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
That is a great story. Okay, so we're gonna move to your post Aiden career.
Okay.
And one of the first things that you did, even when you were at Aiden, you had started this, but this is something that's just kind of been you ever since I've known you, is your mentorship of young Montessori leaders. I know that I have some colleagues that I taught with at Aiden who still work with you, and we still connect and talk about Montessori. So what I really appreciate is that, you're there for us when we have a challenge that we haven't seen. We can call you and you'll just pick up the phone and talk us through it. But for me, one of the most beneficial areas of expertise that you offer is a systems approach to education. So organizational systems make sense in the corporate world, but it's also very, very relevant when trying to run a school. Can you talk a little bit about the systems thinking approach and how it applies to school leadership?
Yeah. Well, this is a very unique approach. I think leadership is starting to catch on to it much more deeply now as we live in such complex times, moving away from hierarchy. What you become so intimately aware of in running a school is that it's a deeply interconnected, interdependent living system. It's not a mechanical system. It's a living system. And that's one of the reasons it's so difficult to lead a school, is that it's a networking, constantly connecting, interconnecting, constantly moving set of humans. And it's not only the children, but all the staff, but all the parents and their parents and their nannies and on and on. It's just a very deeply interconnected system. And so understanding from nature, we are natural beings, that we are guiding. We can't manage it. We have to guide it, just like we guide the children in the environment. We guide that living system. And so as a school leader, our position in it is just extremely important. For example, one of the things that we learn is that our being a non-anxious presence is a way of keeping the anxiety that's running through the school from becoming a virus in itself. You talk about emotions. And so going through even now with the pandemic, it's so important that we understand our presence in relationship to others, and how we are able to keep the calm and the love that needs to be in that environment.
Well said. I always think about when you talk about organizational systems, oftentimes you give the metaphor of the mobile, right, that's hanging over an infant's
Yes.
crib, and no matter
Yes.
where you touch the mobile,
Yep.
the
I
whole
have
thing
one in
moves.
my room here. Yes.
Right. So with my admin team, every time we make a decision, I actually bring that up. And we
Oh,
try
wow.
to envision what, if we make this one change, if we touch this, like, what is the domino effect?
Exactly.
It's a very, like, I think I learned that and this actually segues us into our next question. So I think I learned that in the 2016-2017 module that we did with whole school management.
Yes.
So after you retired from Aiden,
Yeah.
you started working on the whole school management program through NAMTA. I think that's correct, right?
Yes, it was. Yes,
Oh,
it was called whole school management, and it was more on the management side, but I was sneaking my way into the leadership side.
well, and then it evolved into the Whole School Leadership Institute, which I believe you were the founder, right?
I'm the founder and the executive director. Yes.
So can you talk a little bit about WSLI?
Yes.
which I'm actually going to be connecting with you in Houston
Yes.
this year. At
Yeah.
the end of this year, I'll be down in
Awesome.
Houston to see you
Yep.
for WSLI.
Yep. That's exciting. I'm so glad you're coming. So when I retired, I had already spent about 35 years behind the scenes in the organizational development world. It's the OD world. Um, Leaders in education don't get trained in how to facilitate others, how to use the methods that often OD consultants come in and do for you, and then they leave. And just learning how to build a community where everyone feels safe and that they belong and that they can keep on growing and developing. That's nowadays called the everyone culture, where the school culture is a place where everyone is growing, not only the children, but the adults. I trained in so much of that over so many years behind the scenes, put it into place when I was at Aiden. And so I ended up, as I retired, creating this course that we now do all over the world. And it's a Montessori leadership course. It's 6 modules. They take about 2 years to go through because you go through a module and then you have to put it into practice, and you have to, it's like soak time, getting that into your bones, like the mobile that you're describing. That's a key ingredient in one of the modules. And so I started doing it in person. We opened in Houston, actually at the Post Oak School, which is an AMI school. At the high school, we used the high school facility, and people came from really all over the world. And it was a fantastic launch. That group named themselves the Wings of Trust, that cohort, and they are graduating this summer. They're just finishing. I designed the course and did it privately for a couple of years. We met just before the refresher, the AMI refresher, and then we met during the summer at the Ma retreat. And then 2 grantors came and said, we will underwrite and grant fund your organization so that you can become a nonprofit. So that was in 2018. And I was able at that time to choose a founding board that looked like the face of our nation in its diversity. And that was one of the greatest joys of my life. I deeply cherish our board. And we were off and launched and running as a nonprofit. And just as the pandemic was starting to happen, we canceled our in-person classes until next time you're coming in November in Houston. And we have been serving our Montessori community all over the world on Zoom. So we have any number of cohorts going through the course in any number of countries. We even one summer during the pandemic had a wonderful Montessori leader in Norway who was out on his boat with his family in the middle of the night attending our course because it was 7 hours later for him. But we have a big EU cohort all over Europe. We have people in Nigeria. We have an incredible man from Nepal, Kathmandu, Nepal, who's now going through Montessori training, AMI training in the US. People in Saudi Arabia, the Philippines, South America. It's been an opportunity to know that we all have the same thing in common. We are all here for humanity and for creating environments that are optimum for children. And our work is the same no matter where we are. It's universal everywhere in the world. And we're sharing the universality of this time in history as well together.
Wow. So I was actually scheduled to join the
Seattle,
cohort
yes, and we
in April
canceled
of
it.
2020,
I
right?
know, I
That didn't
know.
work out.
Yeah.
But the silver lining, what I'm hearing is that it's allowed WSLI to become more global and has
Yes,
given, your mentorship opportunities a much more global group of mentees, I guess. Is that the
yes,
right word?
yes. We have built a training team now, and we're able to be there for people. And if we do a whole reflection process online after each session of the module, there's 9 sessions in each module and online. It's 5, 6 days when you come in person. And so that reflection process gives us a sense of how people are doing, and a chance for us to move in and help out when that's really needed. And what happens is the community starts to get built, and they start helping each other out. So now we have whole school Google group, and people can ask each other questions and get help from one another. It's becoming a worldwide community, all doing the same work across the world.
That's really cool. And that also shows how universal Montessori is, because it's about the human tendencies, and
Yes.
the brain science doesn't change depending on where you
Oh,
live. So it's
yes,
it's actually a testament to what Montessori is pedagogically. Really cool.
exactly.
Well, Kathy, hey, thank you so much for your lifetime contribution to the
Thank you.
Montessori movement and for taking time to do the interview. I hope to see you soon in Orlando for the Montessori experience.
Thank you so much. I look forward to that too. And it's so great to be with you, Joe. This has been absolutely a joy.
All right, take care.